Hello, this is Jerry Morton. Welcome to my podcast series, Finding My Way, a memoir by Jerry Morton. This is podcast 80, Courage Comes to Town. Podcast 80, Courage Comes to Town, is a reporting of a special happening during the Knoxville, Tennessee's 1982 World's Fair. By chance, Jerry witnessed a display of courage by the Warsaw Symphony Orchestra. Podcast 80, Courage Comes to Town. Knoxville was in full swing hosting the 1982 World's Fair. Our 12-year-old son had earned a season pass for serving as a volunteer in the early stages of the World's Fair. He explained to area students what to expect when attending it. His role was part of the fair's promotional efforts. We purchased summer passes for our daughter, my wife, and me, so that we could enjoy the events as well. In anticipation of relatives and friends visiting us that summer, we converted the downstairs laundry room into a bathroom. At first, we planned to purchase replicas of late 1800s bathroom trappings. You know, a clawfoot bathtub, a pedestal wash basin, a wooden medicine cabinet, old brass light fixtures, wood paneling, and the like. To my surprise, I discovered that the real antique items were less expensive than the imitations. So we ended up with a late 1800s real bathroom. Well, there was one exception to that. I couldn't find one of those old-time commodes that has the water tank high above the commode with a chain to pull that would release the water down a pipe in a big rush into the back of the commode, enabling it to flush. We did find a commode that was probably from the 1940s. It looked old enough to fit into the antique atmosphere we had created. The major drawback of attending events at the World's Fair was the long lines. No matter what pavilion you wanted to visit or event you wished to attend, there were long lines. The Chinese pavilion had the longest line. It had a few of the actual clay figures recovered from the massive tomb of an ancient emperor. This was reported to be the first time that the Chinese government had sent any of the clay figures out of the country. The figures were of soldiers guarding the body of the emperor. If one could judge by the long and twisting lines of people waiting to get into the pavilion, everyone who attended the fair viewed the clay soldiers. My standing joke from the World's Fair days went like this. The lines at the World's Fair were so long that I stood in one line for 2 hours before I got close enough to the entrance to the building to realize that I was standing in the line to the women's restroom. That line still gets a laugh from Knoxvillians who were in attendance back then. The joke wasn't far from the truth. By midsummer, our two kids, Anna and I, had developed a pattern of attending the fair. I would drive the kids to the fair site in the early afternoon on Saturday. Usually one or the other had a friend with them. We would negotiate a time for me to pick them up at a designated spot within the fairgrounds at a reasonable hour that evening. If there were a special events being scheduled during that afternoon I was interested in, I would stay at the fair to attend it. If there were an event I wanted to attend during the early evening, I would drop the kids off in the afternoon, go home, and then returned to the fair for the event. Anna appreciated the quiet time at home, as she was a high school English and French teacher. She treasured the time she had to develop her lesson plans and related teacher activities for the coming year. There were a lot of special musical events, outdoor drama shows, and other performances that were of great quality. I didn't have the time to attend many of them. It wasn't that any one event was that long. It was the hassle of getting to the actual event that was the killer. You spent time finding a place to park, walking long distances from the parked car to the fairgrounds, and then stood in a long line to get the ticket or seating pass to attend the event. Many times after all that, you'd get to the entrance of an event to discover that the event had recently filled all of the seating. You couldn't get in. The free events were usually just as good as the paid ones, but you had to stand in line for a long time before it was your turn to enter. Often the line of people in front of you would just start breaking up. The meaning of that was clear. The event was full. You had just stood in line for more than an hour to learn that you couldn't get in. For the most part, Anna and I never tried to attend a special presentation. It just wasn't worth the hassle to us. Clearly, there were others who valued the special events enough to stand in long lines repeatedly in the hope of experiencing the cultural programs. One Saturday night, the kids wanted to be picked up a little later than usual. If I remember right, they wanted me to meet them at the fair around 10 p.m. It was hot that late July evening. I decided to arrive at the fair early and just walk around for a while. There might be some special event worth standing in line to experience. Basically, I was just passing the time until I was to meet the children and we'd all go home. After walking into the fairgrounds as just one of the many crowded passageways for an hour or so, I noticed a long snaking line into the outdoor pavilion. The pavilion had a huge tent-like cover over the opening stage and the rows and rows of tiered seating. There was only bleacher-type seating provided for attendees in the curved rows of seating aisles. There were 3 sections of seating, with the middle section directly fronting the performance area. Since the canopy over the seating area and the stage was designed to protect the audience and performers from the elements, you could see all the way across the covered setting and observe the upper portions of the pavilions connected to the fair. This open air allowed whatever cooling breeze the summer night might produce to touch your face and provide a little relief from the lingering heat of the day. I had no idea as to what the mass of people were hoping to witness. Standing in this line was as good as standing in any other line. Whatever I was going to see, it would help pass the time until I was to meet the children. I wasn't at the end of the long line. More and more people behind me began lining up. People wanted to see the event, whatever it was. Time passed slowly to match the progress of the line into the pavilion. Finally, I got close enough to the entrance to see the official who was allowing people to enter. As he allowed each person to pass him, he noted a number on a sheet of paper and then directed the person to some open seating. Finally, there was just one person in front of me speaking to the attendant. The attendant looked at his sheet of paper. The person in front of me and then at me as he began shouting, "Two more after this one. We are at capacity." With that, he motioned me and the person behind me in. I was the second to last person allowed into the pavilion to see the performance. As I looked at the stage, I could tell it would be an orchestra performance. The instruments were all around the empty chairs. There were a few musicians doing something with their instruments, but that was it. What struck me as out of sync as I observed the stage was the 4 or more bulky men dressed in ill-fitting black suits, pacing back and forth between the stage and the seated audience. They appeared to have imposed an impenetrable barrier between the audience and the stage. Their facial expressions were uniformly grim. I found an opening in the center section in a row of bleachers about a third of the way up from the front of the stage. People leaned in their seats, allowing a passage to open as I climbed to the space. It was just about perfect for witnessing the performance. My seatmates were most warm in welcoming me as I sat in their midst. As the crowd awaited the orchestra members to enter the stage, I looked around, observing the audience. I was surprised to see seated in the row behind me a lot of University of Tennessee faculty members and Unitarian Church regulars I recognized. I didn't remember the names of many of them. Eventually, I noticed the written poster near the stage. This was the Warsaw Symphony Orchestra from Poland. I realized why this was such a popular event. The national news coverage of the protests for freedom by huge numbers of Polish people from Russian control was a nightly news event. A man named Lech Walesa was leading the protest. The Soviets and their Polish government puppets were using heavy-armed tactics to suppress the freedom protesters. No one knew if the Russians would send in tanks to put the peaceful rebellion down, as they did the last time one of the Eastern European countries' citizens rose up against them. That was in Hungary in 1956, I believe. The situation was really tense in Poland. People were disappearing there. By all reports, the secret police and government forces were brutally assaulting the thousands of freedom demonstrators. I was more than a little surprised that the Russians would allow the orchestra to leave Poland to perform in the United States. At last, the orchestra members began filing onto the stage. The crowd broke into applause. They were dressed in black. With military precision, they walked single file to their music stations. The audience applauded as the instruments were held in the ready position. Silence filled the air until the conductor appeared. When he assumed his place at the head of the musicians, the audience again showered the pavilion with applause. Unfortunately, my familiarity with classical music was poor. All I can recall about the performance was that I thoroughly enjoyed it. The pieces they played were moving. There seemed to be subtle sadness in them at times, but an overall sense of calm seemed to have been conveyed from the musicians to the audience. At intermission, the conductor had the orchestra members stand to receive the audience appreciation. In an orderly manner, the musicians left the stage. They returned for the second half of their performance in the same manner in which they had appeared, at the beginning of their presentation. The second half of the performance ended with a very energetic and moving piece. The audience rose to their feet in great appreciation amidst a thundering applause and multiple shouts of bravo and encore. Then a strange suppression to the clapping and shouting seemed to take place as the orchestra members sat in their chairs. The audience returned to their seated positions. I guessed there was going to be an additional piece played by the symphony in response to the cries of encore. Suddenly, there was a large, ruffling sound behind me. It was coming from the row directly behind me. I turned to see a large banner held in the hands of the standing audience members stretching across the entire middle section of the pavilion. On the banner, written in large black capital letters, was the word Solidarity. Solidarity was the slogan of the resistance movement Lech Walesa was leading in Poland. It was the anti-government protesters' rallying cry at their gatherings. The orchestra members froze in their seats. Not one of them moved. They sat like stiff-backed statues, staring straight ahead. The only movement near the stage was the strange, ill-fitting black-suited weightlifter-type men staring at the audience while they slowly rocked on their heels, daring someone to make a move. Silence hovered in the air. Seconds began ticking into a minute, and then two. The audience sensed tension in the quietness. I knew that lives could be well on the line, not for the audience, but for the musicians when they returned to Poland. Their frozen bodies told me that they knew that too. Very calmly and deliberately, the lead violinist, the first violinist, picked up her bow and began gently tapping it on her music stand. Several other musicians quickly followed her example, and then several more, and then everyone in the entire orchestra began tapping their music stands. The spontaneous roar of support and appreciation from the audience filled the air. It was not possible for anyone to speak as the roar of the audience made hearing anything other than it impossible. The conductor signaled the musicians to stand and bow. They did, and the audience did the impossible. Their show of support to these brave men and women was even louder and more joyous than anyone could have thought possible. The musicians left the stage to this continued salute to their courage to speak for freedom. As I left the pavilion, all the eyes I saw were as wet as mine.